for radical Christians, radical Islam and such, and therefore have the right answer to keeping America safe, I think is just fundamentally wrong. And I'll say this, I had plenty of disagreements with President George W. Bush on a spectrum of issues, but I still marvel at the fact that after all we went through on 9/11, he would say to America, quote, "All Americans must recognize that the face of terror is not the true face of Islam. Islam is a faith that brings comfort to 1 billion people around the world. It's a faith that has made brothers and sisters of every race. It's a faith based upon love, not hate." Thank you, President George W. Bush, for reminding us at that terrible moment in history who the real enemies were. They weren't people of the Islamic faith. They were those who had violent, extreme views and were ready to kill, to execute that, like the Ku Klux Klan, like the hate mongers of the Westboro Baptist Church. That president at that moment in history got it right. And we've got to get it right today, because we're being called on, like many generations have in the past, to respond to a legitimate fear of terrorism in a way consistent with our American values. And when we lapse into this notion that we are going to condemn a faith, I think we've gone way too far. Ms. Kara, I know you wanted to say something earlier, but let me ask you first. Do you live in a Muslim neighborhood?
No, I do not.
You know what a Muslim neighborhood is?
I was scratching my head a bit when I first heard that term used. The Muslim community in the United States, with few exceptions, is actually quite spread out and integrated into the broader America.
That's my experience too. I mean, I can show you some Irish Catholic parishes in Chicago and some areas on the North Shore where Jewish populations live, but the Muslim population is not that large per se, and they seem to be dispersed. And when we talk about patrolling and enforcing Muslim neighborhoods, as one member of this panel has, I'm at a loss. What was he trying to say? What is a Muslim neighborhood?
No, I think you're absolutely right. And Senator, if I could just add to your statement of acknowledging President Bush and what he did, and the importance really of bipartisanship. I think this issue of really pushing back against these frankly un-American and unconstitutional proposals to marginalize and target a group of Americans based on their faith it's not consistent with the Constitution. It's not consistent with our values. And I might add that it's not just yourself and some members on your side of the dais, but I also want to specifically acknowledge Senator Flake and Senator Graham, who've been very courageous with their words as well in urging to tamp down this kind of divisive rhetoric.
Let me just add, and thanks Senator Graham who's here, but let me just add, I called Senator Flake at his home on a Saturday evening when he visited a mosque in Arizona and thanked him.
I sent personal thank you letters to Senator Flake and Senator Graham.
It was such a thoughtful gesture. Totally consistent with what President George W. Bush reminded us.
That was the mosque I attend, Senator.
Yes. Well, I thank Senator Flake for having the courage to do it.
Thank you.
Yield the floor.
And Senator Durbin, can I just add one more thing that I wanted to say earlier, and that was, I just want to make it clear that there have been hundreds of imams and Islamic religious scholars in the United States and around the world that have condemned terrorism, routinely condemned terrorism, and in fact, there are a number of U.S. Muslim religious scholars who have actually taken on the narrative of ISIS, in fact, at great peril to themselves. A number of them have received specific death threats from ISIS because of that work that they're doing, and so I cringe when I hear people saying that Muslims are not speaking out against the contortion of their faith for violent ends.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Durbin. Senator Graham.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think this is an important hearing, and I'm glad we're having it. So I need to probably go to my own church, then go to a mosque. I haven't been to my own church in a while. Is there a fight for the heart and soul of Islam afoot between a few radicals and most Muslims? Is that a fair statement? Either one of you?
Sure, Senator Graham.
With the Muslim faith?
That's my book, A Battle for the Soul of Islam, is about the fact that this is, terrorism is simply a symptom, and the underbelly of it. And I cringe at the moral equivalence.
So the answer is yes?
Yes, sir.
All right. So what about you, ma'am?
I think there's Sorry, there is definitely robust discussion within Muslim communities in the U.S. and around the world.
It's important for America to side with those that would live in peace with us and would build a better world in the faith, which is overwhelming supermajority?
Yes, absolutely.
And it's not only peace, it's those that share our values of liberty and individual rights.
So here's what I've learned after 37 trips to Iraq and Afghanistan. Most people over there are not buying what ISIL's selling, the Taliban or Al-Qaeda. All things being equal, most moms and dads don't want to turn their daughters over to these nut jobs. So when I hear they're all the same, you need to go over there more, because they're not. The bottom line is that most people will be culturally different, but sort of buy into the idea that radical Islam is not for them. So we need partners in the faith. Now, back here at home, how many of you think we're fighting a war and not a crime? How many of you think we're at war, a state of undeclared war with radical Islam? Do you feel comfortable with that?
I think we're doing both. There's obviously a war.
Yeah, I agree. But, I mean, they've declared war on
activity.
us.
Yeah.
So there's a difference between fighting a war and a crime, and this is really important. What do we do when we find, are there radical imams out there in the country that sympathize with ISIL and Al-Qaeda inside the country, inside the United States?
I've never heard of one inside the United States.
I believe there are imams that may condemn violence, the tactic, but I think they sympathize with the division of the world into Dar al-Islam and Dar al-Harb, which is, in Arabic, the land of Islam and the land of war. So there are those who believe that war can be fought not by necessarily guns and ammunition, but by civilizational jihad, where they believe they can advance their ideas through a evangelism of their theopolitical mentality.
The only reason I mentioned this is I don't want to profile the Muslim, let me tell you my experience with the American Muslim. Young man who grew up in Afghanistan, went to high school in Afghanistan, graduated from high school, came to, I think, Chicago. I can't remember his American hometown. Joined the Army, went back to Afghanistan as an interpreter, took me over to his former high school where they were having election polling, wearing a uniform. His job was to guard me and the general that went with me. There were about 8 or 10 of us. He embraced his principle. He started crying. All of us started crying. So that's my view of American Muslims. They're out there in the fight. But if you do have a radical mosque or a radical preacher or a radical whatever, is it okay to follow them and monitor what they do?
So I think there's a difference between somebody who has radical thoughts or is espousing radical thoughts and then actual violence. I think, as you can certainly appreciate, Senator Graham, having radical thoughts is not illegal. Some would actually say it's downright American.
No, I agree, but it's not downright American to be sympathetic. See, when I first went in the Air Force, I had to sign a form that I wasn't a member of the Communist Party. Well, that was in 1977. I'm sure if I said I was, I would not have gotten into the Air Force. So the enemy was the communist ideology. So all I'm suggesting is that this young man, who happens to be an American Muslim, hates the ideology as much as I do, if not more, because he'd be the first victim, not me. They'd kill him before they'd kill me, because he's, in their eyes, worse of a problem. What I'm trying to suggest here is that the guy who did the killing in Orlando went to the same mosque as the guy who was the suicide bomber in Syria. What are the odds of that happening without something going on in that mosque and they not really know each other?
I'd like to address that.
Sure.
As a subject matter expert and a law enforcement officer who took a vow to protect the American people from threat, both foreign and domestic, this icon of this organization, which is a major global level organization operating in the United States, says very plainly in its logo what its intention is. In English, it says Assembly of Muslim Jurists of America.
Well, you're not answering my question.
What I'm trying to say is that there is a current within the Islamic community in the United States to conform to Sharia law. What we're actually talking about aren't the tactics of radicalism or jihad.
I got you. You're not answering my question. Who's the FBI guy?
I was a former FBI.
Okay. What are the odds of these two guys going to the same mosque and not know each other?
I have no idea what those odds are, but that was something the FBI investigated, so I'm sure
Andrew,
that's something you can find out.
all I'm suggesting is I'm all in to partnering with the faith because you can't win the war without it. American Muslims if there's a hero in this war, it's an American Muslim who will take up arms against radical Islam. If I had to create a hero for the times in which we live, it's somebody of the Muslim faith who's an American citizen, wear the American uniform and take the fight over there to these bastards. So that's my perspective. But when you have centers of radical activity, I don't want us to get so politically correct, and that's the whole purpose of this hearing, is that we ignore the obvious. How in the hell could it be that the guy that killed 49 people in a club in Orlando who went to the same mosque as the guy who became a suicide bomber in Syria, that there's not something going on there, and how did the FBI miss it?
It's entirely reasonable to figure that, and if we feel like we're so hamstrung we can't investigate
That's the point of this hearing. Have we gone too far the other way that you can't talk about the obvious?
Let me suggest this. In my case, we proved that the mosque was the hub of the conspiracy, that it was used for the storage of weapons, that it was used for recruiting, for conspiratorial conversations, for plotting, and they used it because they thought that was a safe place to do that. And if we signal, and it's not just a signal, it's a fact, that we are closing not just our law enforcement, but our intelligence gathering and investigative eyes in what's supposed to be a war where we actually have an authorization of military force and people in harm's way, then we're not fighting a war that we have any interest in winning.
Now, having said that, I believe that the overwhelming majority of mosques in this country are not that way. But when you find a connection, how do we deal with it, ma'am? Doctor, could you, I want your perspective as much as anybody else. I'm trying to solve a problem. I'm trying to prevent an attack.
Senator, the problem comes to how you define radical. Right now, when we say violent extremism is the problem, we define radical as those who would want to take up arms against America. And you have people lining up, signing fatwas and religious rulings that they are nonviolent, they condemn the terror. But when you define radical as those who are anti-Semitic, who are homophobic, who perpetrate conspiracy theories about American military and American policies, all of these are the underbelly of ideas.
Well, Mr. Cohen would agree with you, right?
And our community needs a 12-step program. The reason he can be at the same mosque is there is such a complete denial between the connection of nonviolent Islamism to violent Islamism that they're going to be at the same mosque and not realize it because they're not going to connect. Just like the alcoholic that needs that first step, they're in denial. And we perpetrate that denial by ignoring the verbiology.
Ma'am, what would you say?
I think law enforcement, if there's reasonable suspicion of criminal activity, law enforcement needs to go there and they need to conduct a full investigation.
That's a good way to end this. And that's all we're talking about. It's fighting a war, not a crime. Good surveillance techniques that are within the constitutional values. And I am convinced that the purpose of this hearing, Senator Cruz, that you've worried that we've gone too far the other way. And that's all I'm saying. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Graham. Mr. McCarthy, in your testimony, you talked about peaceful Muslims here in America who worked with you and were integral to helping prosecute the Blind Sheikh case. Can you describe to this committee the difference between the Muslim faith and Islamism that embraces violent jihad?
I think it's hard to define the Muslim faith because there are too many divergent interpretations of it. It's easy to identify what we call Islamism, or I prefer to call Sharia supremacism, which is really a radical political ideology with a religious veneer, not a religion as we understand it in the West. My impression listening to the back and forth today is that we are underestimating how serious a problem it is. I don't think it's a handful of radicals versus everyone else who is just embracing the West. I brought along a well-known classic Sharia manual today that I'll supply with the committee's permission, called Reliance of the Traveler, which is an ancient authoritative manual of Sharia law. I open to the page that says jihad. Jihad means to war against non-Muslims, and it explains where the etymology of it is drawn from. We could go through several different aspects of it, whether it's penalties for apostasy, inequality against women, inequality against non-Muslims, and so forth. I think, Mr. Chairman, the reason that it's relevant is this is not, crazy Islamophobic Andy McCarthy's view of what Islamism is. This is a manual that, in the front of it, they thought it was important enough to include the endorsement of the Al-Azhar Research Academy, basically the Sharia faculty at the seat of Sunni Islamic learning since the 10th century. It's also endorsed by the International Institute of Islamic Thought, which is a Muslim Brotherhood think tank that's been operating in the United States, I believe, since the early 1980s. There are other endorsements as well. But the point is that this political ideology, which is radical in the United States because it would supplant our Constitution since its core tenets are antithetical to our Constitution. So to me, that's radical, whether you want to blow up a bridge to get it done or not. If you want to supplant the United States Constitution with a totalitarian legal code and societal framework, that's pretty radical. There's an awful lot of people who buy onto this to one degree or another. Some percentage of them will become jihadists. Some larger percentage of them will create enclaves or safe spaces, I guess that's the popular common term, right? Safe spaces for this ideology to take root and to grow. And the forcible commands in it and the bellicose interpretation of it is something that is preached and endorsed by very influential scholars in this belief system. So it's a shame that it has enough religious tenets to it, the oneness of Allah, the duty to pray, and so on, that we allow it to cloak itself in the guise of religion rather than what it actually is, which is a totalitarian political philosophy and ideology. But I think we make a big mistake when we underestimate the hold that it has on a group as big as 1.6 billion people.
And Dr. Jasser, if I understood you correctly, it was your testimony that we do a disservice to the American Muslim community when we lump in peaceful Muslims who share our values with the Islamists who, as you've written about, are waging a war for the soul of Islam. Is that a fair understanding?
Yes, sir. I think that it's too easy to, if people ask where are the voices of moderate Islam, there's been no urgency. It's time that Muslims wake up, that there's an urgency for us to speak out, not just against the tactic, but against the root cause. And our Muslim reform movement is trying to do that. It's a bipartisan effort to try to lay out what are the ideas that make us Muslims that believe in the faith of Islam, that separate us from this global, massive political movement, Islamism. Large parties. And at the core is this identification with the Islamic State. The reason ISIS is recruiting to the levels it is Muslims growing up in this country and in the West end up wanting to die for that identification in the Islamic State. The only counter to that is not this whack-a-mole of countering extremism, but starting to teach our kids that it would be much preferable to want to die for America. Until we start teaching Muslims that difference and engaging programs that do that, we're going to continue this whack-a-mole program.
Well, Dr. Jasser, I thank you for your courage in defending truth at risk and at knowing risk of great personal vilification and even personal risk. That is a powerful and important demonstration of courage.
Thank you.
You know, when Senator Graham was asking his questions, I found one exchange with Ms. Kira really quite remarkable in that Senator Graham asked if there were any radical imams in the United States who had sympathies with ISIS and al-Qaeda, and Ms. Kira's testimony was she had never heard of any radical imams in the United States who had sympathies with al-Qaeda or ISIS. I found that truly an astonishing statement, although I would note it was a statement entirely consistent with the purge that Mr. Haney testified about, the Obama administration has undertaken, because indeed, one of the things the purge did is, and I quote, removed references to mosques specifically as a radicalization incubator. So she was testifying consistent with this purge. I wanted to ask some of the other witnesses on this panel if you share Ms. Caro's view of having never heard of a radical imam in the United States who embraces or who sympathizes, that was Senator Graham's exact question, with ISIS or al-Qaeda. I know, Mr. Gubbets, you went undercover at CARE. Did you encounter?
Well, first of all,
please turn your microphone off.
Well, we can't forget, and I'll go into some current imams, but Anwar al-Awlaki was an imam. The blind sheikh was one of the most knowledgeable people of Sharia, one of the most knowledgeable scholars on Islam. My time at CARE, Siraj Wahaj consistently talks about the implementation of Sharia law, which is no different than the ideology of al-Qaeda or ISIS. Anyone that reads their magazines, anyone that studies their ideology, they are constantly quoting Islamic law from the hadiths of Bukhari and Muslim, from the Quran. They are constantly quoting that. No different than any of the imams like Imam Siraj Wahaj. I think we have a fundamentally flawed approach to this, this war. We have to look at Sharia, and it is as Mr. McCarthy said, this is a much bigger problem than what we're willing to accept.
So Mr. Gubbets, when Omar Satine was talking to 911 at 2:35 a.m., that call was recorded, and we now have the transcript. I'll read a portion of it. The operator asked, "What is your name?" "My name is, I pledge allegiance to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi of the Islamic State." "Okay, what is your name?" "I pledge allegiance to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, may God protect him," Arabic, "on behalf of the Islamic State." That's what the tape recording showed. However, when the Attorney General released it, the words that were omitted were Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi of the Islamic State, and then 2 sentences later, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, and then the second half of that state, the Islamic State. What does it say to you that the Department of Justice is sanitizing and erasing the statement of who the Orlando terrorist was pledging his allegiance to?
It means if we don't change course, we can expect more tragedies like what happened in Orlando.
And that would be consistent also with the purge explicitly removing, quote, references to mosques specifically as a radicalization incubator. Would you put that in the same category?
Yes, sir.
All right, Mr. McCarthy, I want to talk about, you talked about the threat of Islamism, and I want to talk about some of the symbols, some of the evidence we had in terror attack after terror attack, because some of my Democratic colleagues have suggested this is simply about the use of a word or two, or even, as my friend Senator Coons says, about 3 letters, ism. And I would suggest that the only reasonable conclusion from this hearing is that this deliberate and willful blindness is costing American lives over and over again. Whether you look at Little Rock or Fort Worth or Chattanooga or San Bernardino, over and over again we see warning signs. Over and over again the Obama administration has evidence of radical Islamic terrorism, and over again it doesn't act to prevent it. I would mention Nidal Hassan. The Obama administration knew that he had been in electronic communication with the radical Islamic cleric Anwar al-Awlaki, who Mr. Gubbets just made reference to. The Obama administration knew that he had asked about the possible justifications for waging jihad against his fellow soldiers. And yet, the administration did nothing. And Nidal Hassan murdered 14 innocent souls. In your view, is a soldier communicating with a radical Islamic cleric, Anwar al-Awlaki, asking about the permissibility of waging jihad against his fellow soldiers, preparing PowerPoint presentations, laying out what he believed was a Quranic command to wage jihad. In your view, are those significant red flags that it should have moved the administration to action?
They're highly significant red flags, and to dismiss them because it was consistent with his research, as I understand was the main reason, is reckless.
And indeed, what his fellow officers said, part of the reason that they did not act against him was political correctness. Let's look at another example, the Tsarnaev brothers in Boston. The administration knew that Russia had pointed out that the Tsarnaev brothers had traveled to predominantly Muslim Chechnya and Dagestan provinces. He was interviewed by the FBI, the elder brother. Russian authorities a second time notified the administration that they believed them to be religious extremists. The elder brother returned to Chechnya and met with Chechen terror-related groups. He posted on YouTube a public call to jihad. And yet the administration had stopped watching him at that time, did not see the public call to jihad. And that ended up culminating in the two brothers setting off pressure cooker bombs at the Boston Marathon that murdered 3 people and injured approximately 180 others. Are those, once again, significant red flags that ought to be met with a serious law enforcement and national security response to prevent acts of terrorism?
I believe they are, and I think they underscore the problem with treating ideology as if it were not a trigger to violence.
And the final example I'll focus on is Omar Mateen. Now, Omar Mateen was interviewed by the FBI not once, not twice, but 3 times. Omar Mateen had told his co-workers that he was involved with both Al-Qaeda and Hezbollah. Omar Mateen had watched videos of the radical cleric Anwar al-Awlaki. That is one connecting theme of a number of these terrorists. Omar Mateen was interviewed one time because of his relationship with Moner Mohammed Abu Salha, the first American-born suicide bomber who died in Syria in 2004. And there's evidence to indicate they may have attended the same mosque. Are those, again, the sorts of red flags that ought to trigger serious law enforcement and national security scrutiny to prevent terrorist attacks?
Yes, they are.
Is it a reasonable inference in your experience, having spent nearly 2 decades as a prosecutor, that the administration's scrubbing, refusal to acknowledge the existence of jihad or radical Islam, as this chart shows, literally erasing it from their training materials, has some connection to this administration over and over and over again having serious evidence of radical Islamic terrorism and yet not acting to prevent terrorist attacks on United States soil?
I think so. And again, I think it's incredibly reckless to take the position that because ideology is constitutionally protected to have, such that you can't prosecute someone for having it, that you therefore drop investigative efforts and drop intelligence efforts on the theory that ideology is simply something we don't need to worry about.
Thank you, Mr. McCarthy. Senator Coons.
I'm going to defer to Senator Blumenthal for the second round.
Senator Blumenthal, I didn't see you return.
Well, I noticed you were very absorbed in your questions, as you should be, and thank you for having the hearing. I'm interested, in light of the statements of allegiance that were made by the San Bernardino and the Orlando killers, and the credit taken by ISIS for at least the Orlando massacre. What objective evidence there is that ISIS is inspiring or supporting terrorist extremists here? And I think there is evidence of it, if only the evidence that has been made public I understand there is other evidence as well. It troubles me greatly. And I think the nation has to be more vigilant and vigorous in countering the efforts of ISIS to inspire and support extremist violence here. And extremist violence can take a lot of forms, but killing 49 people with an assault weapon qualifies for me as violence. And when it's done with a claim of allegiance to ISIS, then I think it raises some red flags. So let me ask you, Ms. McCarthy and others, what objective evidence you see of ISIS inspiring or supporting
Senator,
this kind of violence?
I think that that ISIS, like Al-Qaeda, like other terrorist organizations, is less important than the ideology which transcends them all and will outlast them all and is what is actually the catalyzing feature here. Now, specifically with respect to ISIS, we know that the organization has made it quite clear that it would like to see jihadists in place in the United States and elsewhere in the West commit acts of terrorism that they can, attribute to ISIS and then take advantage of. But I would suggest to you that it's the ideology more than the organization that is doing the inspiring.
Yeah. Also, I would go a step further and just to point out how serious of a problem this is, the threat doctrine with Sharia. We could kill every member of ISIS tomorrow, and it wouldn't affect the global Islamic movement. It wouldn't affect the global jihad. It would slow it down until they caught up. We could kill every member of Al-Qaeda tomorrow. If we don't address strategies and implement policies to address Sharia and the spread of Sharia doctrine, like Dr. Jasser said, we'll be playing whack-a-mole with jihadi groups. It won't end.
Mr. Germain.
I think we need to be careful. Clearly, where there's a conspiracy, law enforcement should track down everybody who is involved in the conspiracy. But what we have to understand about terrorist methodology is the appeal for anyone anywhere to do something is an act of desperation, right? It's a reflection of their weakness, not their strength. So we have to be very careful when we talk about somebody who answers that appeal to not do what ISIS wants us to do, which is to make believe that they actually are that strong and that there actually is a connection and this person actually was ISIS, rather than some misanthrope who was reaching out for whatever was going to get him in the newspaper and on TV. And if we reward this behavior, whether they're reaching out to ISIS like Omar Mateen was doing or reaching out to white supremacist groups like Dylan Roof was doing, you're giving them an opportunity to be famous and to be a soldier of whatever the cause is. And we need to be very moderate in how we talk about this thing. So we're focusing on real conspiracies because then, as we've seen, co-conspirators can go out and commit other crimes. But if we're talking about somebody just claiming allegiance with no actual connection, I think we should be very careful in actually attributing that to the group that they claim.
Senator Blumenthal.
Yes, Mr. Jasser.
If I can address something I think is really very, very important is that, ISIS taking credit is sort of like the rooster taking credit for the morning, and that they will put out the virus out there. These are not lone wolves. It's a global ideology that taps into vulnerable individuals for whatever reason may be vulnerable. But the root cause is, and I think if you look why domestic policy against radical Islam is also connected to our foreign policy, same thing. The vacuum in Syria, you cannot get rid of ISIS in Syria without also ending the Assad regime. The two are two evils that feed off of one another. Secular autocracy and the relationship of this battle within the House of Islam is a cancer that rooted in Syria right now and is spreading all over the planet as they seek recruits and will take and try to mobilize their recruits they tap into this fervor of political Islam, the allegiance to the Islamic State and that identity. And until we have a coherent domestic and foreign policy with a unifying vision of where we are and the role American Muslims should play in that battle happening within the House of Islam, we're going to continue to see this recur and recur. We could get rid of ISIS tomorrow with a 6-month operation to do it in Syria, and it'll come up because the dictators there like to see radical Islam as a foil in order to suppress their populations throughout the Middle East.
I understand. Mr. Haney, were you going to make a point? I saw you leaning forward.
Yes, thank you. During my time as a law enforcement officer, we conducted what we call IDSO, Intelligence-Driven Special Operations. Over the course of 4 or 5 years, I interviewed about 25 to 35 young American citizens who were going to a madrasa in South Africa. And they were in a program called the Alim program. It takes 7 years to go through it, and they become qualified to be imams. They were all Hafiz. They'd all memorized the Quran in madrasas right here in the United States, not overseas. They never finished public school. They memorized the Quran, and when they became graduation high school age, they went to the madrasas in South Africa because they teach in English. I saw it up close and personal with a large cohort of American citizens and or sons of immigrants, still lawful permanent residents. I saw them transform from young men into adults, not only in physical nature, but in terms of their commitment to the ideology that they were studying in South Africa. So I know it's real. That was my specialty. I interviewed hundreds and hundreds of individuals coming back into the United States, both American citizens, lawful permanent residents, and foreign visitors. And virtually every single time, it was exactly the same motivation, commitment to ideology that I saw in every single one of them.
Well, I understand the point that destroying ISIS, destroying the movement of ISIS, destroying the military force of ISIS doesn't destroy the ideology, doesn't destroy the idea. And that's why I asked not just about support, but also inspire, by which I meant ideology as well as potentially recruiting, training, and physically providing support. And I think there are analogies, there have been throughout our history, of forces that want to do us harm through opposing ideology, forces that oppose freedom and democracy and the values of tolerance and free expression and religious freedom that make us the greatest, strongest country in the history of the world. So that's why I'm looking for evidence that ISIS, as it's constituted now, is providing inspiration and support, because we want to stop not only ISIS, but also whatever it's doing to inspire and support extremism and violent extremism in this country, acts of hate and acts of terror. And Orlando was both. I think the president was right about that fact. And the Attorney General of the United States was right about that fact. And you know, I found Mr. Jasser's point about the responsibility of your effort being bipartisan so compelling. Use that word. And I think it's important that we in the Congress be bipartisan in this effort. And the more we are partisan, the weaker we will be. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Blumenthal. Senator Coons.
Thank you, Chairman Cruz. Let me just quickly ask 3 more questions, and then I'm going to conclude if I can. I wanted to follow up a little bit on this idea that ideology is a trigger to violence, and how aggressively or actively we should be going after an ideology rather than actions based on an ideology that Mr. McCarthy suggested. And Mr. McCarthy, I may have misunderstood, but I thought I heard you say that the expansion of the First Amendment in cases during the 1960s to protect radical ideas was a mistake. Is that correct?
I did say that, yes.
Okay. Then let me just, if I could, Mr. Cohen, because
Do you want me to explain what I meant by it, or?
Very concisely, if you would.
Sure.
Give them.
They carved out an exception for the advocacy of ideology that calls for the violent overthrow of the United States, as if there were a firm difference between advocating it and inciting it, which I think has been much more difficult to apply than perhaps they thought.
Mr. Cohen, you've dedicated most of your life to the pursuit of finding and closing down those who engage in not just dangerous ideology, but dangerous actions against other Americans. And Senator Sessions had some interesting, curious comments on the central role of the Southern Poverty Law Center in pushing back against the Klan. And you previously made a point that, just because groups like the Klan, or I would suggest the Lord's Resistance Army, a horrific terrorist group in Central Africa, just because they miscite the Bible, we wouldn't refer to them as radical Christians, and we are similarly making a mistake here if we demonize Islam as radical Islam. Help me understand, in your view, whether we should be engaging in widespread surveillance of the Muslim community, and whether we should be indulging the proposals of some candidates for president in uniform bars on Muslim admission to the United States, or patrols of so-called Muslim neighborhoods in an effort to contain a dangerous ideology. Where do you think that boundary lies between appropriate investigation of those who might have a proclivity to violence and demeaning an entire religion?
I think we're on a very slippery slope and a very, very dangerous one. If I could respond to one thing that Mr. McCarthy said, and perhaps that will put it into context, the abstract advocacy of violence in our country is constitutionally protected speech. What's not protected is, stealing a group and preparing a group for violence. The first is protected by the First Amendment. The latter is a conspiracy, a criminal conspiracy. I think that if we don't hold that distinction sacred, our country will be in trouble. I think that some of the implicit suggestions that we should surveil entire communities are not only ineffective but wildly un-American, and I can't believe that we would countenance that kind of activity in our country. I think it would drive. I think it would more likely drive terrorism than it would root it out.
That is exactly the challenge I think Senator Klobuchar was referencing in her home community, the challenge of striking a balance between investigating, prosecuting those very few individuals who are committed to acts of violence and breaking up conspiracies, and engaging the much broader Muslim community that is loyal and wants to fully enjoy the freedoms of the United States. And without their partnership and effective intervention of that very small number of folks who want to turn an ideology into an action, is really going to be at some risk. Ms. Kara, there was a previous exchange about the importance of removing from training manuals information that was just bigoted and wildly misleading. If you just renew the point, you asserted in your testimony that stigmatizing and marginalizing an entire community based on their faith both chills our First Amendment and also puts us at risk, because it frays the very relationship between law enforcement and millions of Americans. Would you just elaborate on that for a moment?
Yeah, sure. And specifically on your last point, I think the concern is that if you create mistrust between law enforcement in our communities, people are going to be reluctant to interact with law enforcement and potentially report crimes. And so that means people who are engaging in potential crimes are not going to be caught and brought to justice. So I think there's a real public safety concern there. And specifically, just to kind of tease out what that the concern is that these these materials were basically setting up a situation where it was calling for either innocuous activity or religiously First Amendment protected activity to now be seen as an indicator of violence. So, for example, growing a beard, attending a mosque or a prayer group were specific items and behaviors that were listed in an FBI intelligence product as being a so-called indicator of violence.
So, in other words, actions that could equally be indicators of being a faithful Muslim.
Correct.
Or in some people's perspectives could be seen as a gradual movement towards radicalization. Removing that from a training manual makes it more likely that law enforcement agents trying to understand Islam will not make the mistake of assuming that all Muslims are radicalized and are inclining towards a violent ideology.
That is correct.
Is that your basic assertion?
That's correct.
Mr. German, last, if I might just close with you. So the assertion's been made indirectly and then directly that the Obama administration has literally put American lives at risk because of political correctness, or even worse, that career law enforcement agents, because of a fear of somehow being politically incorrect, stepped back from doing their job to keep Americans safe. In the instance of Omar Mateen, he was surveilled several times by FBI agents, both directly and indirectly, undercover agents and folks who were sent in to try and see what he might commit to or what he might do. There's two different possible theories of the case here. One is that the Obama administration is disloyal, treasonous, and putting Americans' safety at risk, and so willfully said, we're not going to take any actions against this dangerous radical. I find that disrespectful to what I know of those in state and local and federal law enforcement I've worked with for many years, who frankly, when they see a clear threat to public safety, don't care about political correctness, they care about doing their job. An alternative theory would be that despite repeated attempts to build a credible case against this individual, he didn't bite. He didn't take action. He didn't actually begin a conspiracy. He didn't take proffered offers of opportunities in a way that allowed agents to build a real case against him and proceed. And as Senator Klobuchar indicated, in one of the largest Muslim American communities in America, they have taken case after case after case to trial and actually successfully prosecuted those who took steps to participate in conspiracies. First, does it seem credible to you that career law enforcement agents look the other way out of a concern for political correctness? Or does it seem more credible to you that a deeply disturbed individual who was at different times saying he supported or was involved with groups that are literally fighting each other on the battlefield, was not taking enough credible steps to develop a working case? And then second, New York City Police Commissioner Bill Bratton recently said that wide-scale surveillance programs like an NYPD program that targeted the Muslim community failed to produce a single piece of actionable intelligence and frankly didn't work. I'd be interested in your comment on how we could strengthen the hand of federal and local law enforcement to keep us safe.
On your first question, I do believe the men and women of the FBI are doing everything possible under the law to try to protect us from threats. And in the cases where red flags are raised, investigations actually were pursued. My concern is they're not looking for the right thing. They're not looking for indicators of violence. They're looking for indicators of radicalization, depending on whatever model that is. And in some of these cases, what we see is those clear models are not accurate. And I also agree on the issue with Chief Bratton, where the broad surveillance of entire communities dilutes the ability to actually focus on real threats. And I think that's why during the period those programs were in place, Najibullah Zazi and Faisal Shahzad cases were missed because they were looking too broadly rather than focusing on real threats. In both those cases, they traveled overseas to terrorist training camps. That's something that maybe we should put more resources in rather than surveilling innocent Muslims.
Thank you. Well, I just want to thank the whole panel for your testimony, the members of this committee who've engaged today. I do think we have important and unresolved questions about how to keep Americans safe, how to strengthen the hand of federal, state, and local law enforcement, but in a way that respects our most fundamental values and doesn't come up against the boundaries of cherished First Amendment freedoms. And I frankly think whether you call it radical Islam, radical Islamism, Islamic extremism, spending 3 hours arguing about these semantics, in my view, hasn't really moved us any closer towards developing new and more effective ways to combat terror and to defeat ISIS. And I look forward to the upcoming hearing where we will have Secretary Jay Johnson here, and we can both ask more pointed questions about the Department of Homeland Security and the strategy we will all follow going forward. Let me just close by saying that I am deeply troubled by proposals in our current election season. Proposals made by Mr. Trump to ban all Muslims from coming to the United States. Proposals made to keep a list of all Muslims in the United States, to actively and aggressively surveil mosques, to patrol so-called Muslim neighborhoods, I think are profoundly unhelpful as we try to respect America's constitutional traditions and keep our country safe. And I frankly worry that proposals such as these and the broad following they seem to have gotten harken back to some of the worst chapters in American history. In particular, I'll just remind us that after the attack on Pearl Harbor, this great nation turned its back on Japanese Americans, forcing the relocation and incarceration in camps of over 100,000 people based solely on their Japanese ancestry, not based on any actions taken or any expression of intent to harm Americans or to be disloyal to the United States. And the majority of those, in turn, were American citizens. As I prepared for today's hearing, I could not forget a meeting I had with the daughter of Fred Korematsu, whose name was given to a signal U.S. Supreme Court case. I met his daughter at a ceremony at the White House. And in 1983, when Mr. Korematsu's conviction for violating the internment order was finally overturned, he said, and I quote, "I would like to see the government admit they were wrong and do something about it so this will never happen again to any American citizen of any race, creed, or color." It is my hope that in this debate and in this election season, we will set aside proposals that seem more in keeping with the errors made in the past, where we went after entire groups of American citizens regardless of their substantive actions, and that we would instead live up to our core constitutional commitments and creed and find the right balance between respecting constitutional liberties, welcoming all Americans of whatever background, and finding a bipartisan path forward that will genuinely keep Americans safe. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Coons. I want to thank each of the witnesses for coming and participating in what I believe was a very important hearing. I'm going to very briefly make 3 closing observations. The first, several of my colleagues on the Democratic side of the aisle made invocations of the Ku Klux Klan and drew the analogy of blaming the Klan on Christians to addressing directly and candidly the threat of jihadism and radical Islamic terrorism. I would hope that all of us on both sides of the aisle could agree that the Ku Klux Klan is bigoted and evil and has no place in civilized society. And I would note the suggestion that could somehow be extended to the Christian faith. Dr. Martin Luther King and many of the civil rights pioneers were Christian ministers, Reverend King, and indeed one of the most powerful paeans to justice ever written, the letter from the Birmingham jail, begins, "My dear fellow clergymen, no faith, whether Christian or Jewish or Muslim or any other, has the right to murder others because they do not share that faith. And we should speak candidly and vigorously against anyone advocating for the murder of innocents because of religious hatred and intolerance." A second observation that is disappointing. After hearing a testimony that include Mr. Haney's testimony that some 876 documents were edited or deleted as a result of a purge, it saddens me that not a single one of my colleagues from the Democratic side of the aisle asked even a single skeptical question about that purge, the purge that resulted in deleting the word jihad, dropping it from 126 in the 9/11 report to 0 in report after report after report, that apparently the Orwellian censorship of law enforcement materials and intelligence materials is not a concern to my colleagues, I would note the Senate has a long history of holding the executive accountable regardless of party. And at a time when we're facing a global war on terror, I hope that my colleagues on the Democratic side of the aisle will express real concern about a censorship and editing of law enforcement materials. And the final observation: several times it has been suggested, in a nod towards presidential politics, and I understand the lure of senators to inject themselves in presidential politics a few months before a general election may be irresistible, and I wouldn't know anything about that. But yet, not a single one of my Democratic colleagues asked questions or expressed concerns as to why over and over and over again the administration has failed to respond to red flags, failed to respond to real, significant evidence of radical Islamic terrorism before these terror attacks was carried out, and has failed to connect the dots. Law enforcement can't be perfect. We shouldn't hold them to that standard. But it is the obligation of the Senate to hold them an account when over and over and over again, from Little Rock to Fort Worth to Chattanooga to San Bernardino to the Boston Marathon to Fort Hood to Orlando, the red flags are there, the signs are there, and yet the administration doesn't connect the dots and act to prevent those acts of terrorism. It saddens me that not a single question from the Democratic side of the aisle focused on why didn't we do more to prevent these acts of terrorism before they happen. This isn't a question of semantics. This is a question of whether the administration is willing to acknowledge what the threat is and willing to act to prevent acts of murder and terrorism before they occur. With that, I want to once again thank each of the witnesses for being here. We will keep this hearing record open for an additional 5 business days, which means the record will be closed at the end of business on Thursday, July 7th, 2016. And with that, this hearing is adjourned.
On July 1, 1976, the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum opened its doors to the public, with President Gerald Ford on hand for the dedication. Friday marks the 40th anniversary of the museum, and American History TV's live coverage starts at 6 p.m. Eastern on C-SPAN 3. We'll tour the museum and see one-of-a-kind aviation and space artifacts, including the Spirit of St. Louis and the Apollo lunar module, plus live events at the front of the building. Learn more about the museum as we talk with its director, General J.R. Jack Daly, museum curator Jeremy Kenny, and Valerie Neal, chair of the museum's Space History Department. And you can join the conversation as we'll be taking your phone calls, emails, and tweets. The 40th anniversary of the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, live Friday evening beginning at 6 Eastern on C-SPAN 3's American History TV.
The hard-fought 2016 primary season is over, with historic conventions to follow this summer.
Colorado,
Florida, Texas, Ohio.
Watch C-SPAN as the delegates consider the nomination of the first woman ever to head a major political party and the first non-politician in several decades. Watch live on C-SPAN. Listen on the C-SPAN radio app or get video on demand at cspan.org. You have a front row seat to every minute of both conventions on C-SPAN, all beginning on Monday, July 18th.